Thank you all for your patience. I'm going to turn it over to Luke to kick us off. But if you have any feedback on audio, we've got a single mic to pick you all up here. If you feel like that's too loud or too quiet, message me, Brian Blackman, or the COK-IS webinar account, and we'll work on some of those technical details. We appreciate you working with us.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first ever dual track / hybrid Mayor's Climate Council meeting. Today we are focused on energy and buildings. Before I hand it over to Mayor Kincannon, similar to what Brian just said about providing feedback on the audio through the IS webinar chat feature, we are also going to be using that for our folks who are patching in remotely today if they have questions or anything that they want to bring up for consideration during today's meeting. So again, just use the chat feature to raise your hand, and then we will queue you up for the discussion part of today's meeting. Without further ado, Mayor Kincannon, I kick it off to I kick it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I was wondering, Brian, I was wondering if I could sign into the Zoom so I could see the people on my phone who are not here in person. Is that possible?
Or can I go on a screen?
Well, maybe the screen's for the PowerPoint. I guess. Anyhow,
Yeah.
Is this, and also the Wi-Fi passcode. Just sorry to do the statistics. It would be great for me to be able to see the people who are participating on remotely.
Well, I figured all of us.
Yeah, like,
Yeah,
is that possible?
I can do it temporarily, and then whenever we go back to the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Okay. But we can't just do it on our devices. That's
You
okay,
can
maybe
do it on your device.
Yeah, maybe we'll
I
just
think
do
you
it
could
on
just,
our-
you can either log in through your
Okay.
computer or your phone.
Well, as
Sure.
long as they're up there, that's cool.
That's great. We can see you all. Hello.
Okay.
There we are.
Hi, everybody. Can you see us? Can they see us?
I think if you see top left, you can see Brian's computer.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I can't even see it. Am I on this? Hey, raise your hand up if you can see me. No, they can't see me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm Mayor Kincannon. Literally, I have no idea where I am on this.
You are right here.
Oh, yeah, near.
You're right in the middle.
Near the,
Yep.
right, okay. There, okay. All right, sorry, it's just disorienting a little bit. It's great to see you all. Some of you in person, some of you on Zoom. Thank you for tuning in. Like so many things, COVID-19 has required us to be creative and put a kink in our plans of meeting together. And I'm really looking forward to today's meeting to do this in a new way. I appreciate the council moving forward and your commitment to helping Knoxville reduce emissions by 80% by 2050. Zoom attendees, can you hear me? Okay, great. These meetings are an important step in our communities finding the solutions by which our whole community can achieve that goal. And over the next few months, these working groups and meetings will be looking across transportation, buildings, energy, and waste to help us determine what types of strategies can have the biggest impact and make the most sense for our city. And at the same time, we all know small changes add up as well. So for those of you who aren't aware, I'm sure you are, but this is National Bike Month. So if you can bike to work during especially the week of September 21st to 27th, this is great. If you have a workplace that is outside your home, or maybe take a break biking during your work day. But September 21st to 27th is a great day to do that. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate those of you who are able to come in person because we've never met in person. And that's something that's a little bit difficult, but we're going to evaluate how this goes and see how we want to do it moving forward because there may be more benefits to doing it all 100% virtual. We'll just decide as we experience it. So thank you all for being here, and we'll get on with the meeting. But do we have an opportunity where we will, just say hello and put names and faces together, since we don't meet that often?
Yeah, if you'd like to do that, we could take a moment just to have everyone say who they are.
Should I go around this room first?
Yeah.
We'll start and I think that's how we're going to do the run a show for as far as discussion goes. We'll start with folks who are in the room, and then we'll turn it over to the Zoomers to ask questions and provide comments as well.
If you could stand and maybe wave so they can see you slightly on the camera.
Yeah.
Hi, I am Amy Hathaway, and I am the neighborhood representative for the council.
Thank you.
I'm Rebecca Toline. I'm with TPA.
Hey everyone, Erin Gill, waving on to the door. Chief Policy Officer for the City of Knoxville.
Hello, Fancy Neighbors with the Knoxville Chamber.
Right here, in front of your camera, Brian Blackman, Sustainability Director for the City of Knoxville. And now we're going to mute this so we can speak.
With we will go top left to bottom right. So Michael Davis, you are first up on our screen.
Hi, I'm Michael Davis. I am here representing AIA East Tennessee. So that's the American Institute of Architects chapter of East Tennessee.
Next, to Michael's right, we have Maggie.
Hey, Maggie Schober with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, standing in for Stephen Smith. I'm our Director of Utility Reform. I lead our technical team at SACE.
Can you hear us?
Try again.
Okay, George may not be able to hear us.
Here, I'm George. Did you say George? I can barely hear you all. I'm George Wallace. I'm Coldwell Banker Wallace Realtors.
Thank you, George. Okay, next up we have Gil.
Hi, I'm Gil Huff, Executive Director of Tennessee of the Tennessee Solar Energy Industries Association.
Thank you, Gil. You're not doubling up doing air traffic today, are you?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Bad joke. Sorry. Next is Joshua New.
Joshua New, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, also got the air traffic control headset on.
Yes, you do. Thank you. Gabe Bolus.
Gabe Bolus, KUB. Thanks.
Thank you. To Gabe's right is Erin Rose, one of our presenters today. Erin.
Hi, yeah, Erin Rose. I'm Vice President of Social Equity at 3 Cubed, a local research nonprofit, and I'm facilitating the Equity Working Group.
Thank you, Erin. Up next, Courtney Piper.
Courtney Piper, Executive Director of the Tennessee Advanced Energy Business Council.
Thank you, Courtney. Alicia?
Hi, I'm Alicia Hemmings, and I am the Community Building Lead with Sunrise Knoxville Hub.
Thank you, Alicia, and sorry about the mispronunciation of your name. Let's go to Steve.
Hi, this is Steve Seyfried, and I am the Tennessee Solutions Executive for Amoresco, and I'm presenting with Gil today. Thank you.
Thank you. Last but not least, Stan Johnson. Good afternoon, Stan.
Hey, good brother. This is Stan Johnson from SEED. I'm the Executive Director.
Getting just a little bit of feedback from you. Okay, thanks everybody. At this point, Erin, if you are ready, we will turn it over to you to provide us with an update from the Equity Working Group.
Sure, thanks, Luke. So this month is another quick update from the group, and I promise that as we move along, you probably, hopefully, won't continue to see my face, but as we have more to share out, hopefully you'll see different faces from the Equity Working Group sharing our progress. But for today, I just wanted to share first that we did have a good meeting last week. Aaron Gill was kind enough to introduce the 9 proposed transportation strategies for climate action. So I think that was a good introduction to that sector for this group, and really helpful in shaping our work, our evaluation criteria work, but also helping the Equity Working Group members think about how they can refocus their attention now on community engagement and outreach to their professional social networks in getting feedback on those transportation strategies in general, but also feedback in terms of how can we judge those strategies to best anticipate their impacts on a set of equity related issues. So this is a slide that you've seen before, but I've gone ahead and highlighted where we are thinking in the equity process. And one of the important things that we've just started to discuss is what level or what resources and additional supports will this group need when we move into these additional phases on the left-hand side, from designing solutions to the actual implementation. Right now, our work is really thinking about anticipating those outcomes from these strategies, the proposed transportation strategies. How might they impact a collection or set of issues that the Equity Working Group members currently deal with, again, from economic opportunity issues to social transformation issues to environmental justice issues. So on the right-hand side are really a set of actions that this group has engaged in. Again, starting to refocus efforts on that community engagement with frontline communities, as well as outreach into our professional social networks. And really thinking about how we can work through the barriers that COVID-19 has presented to these community-based organizations in those outreach efforts. And then again, working through a very preliminary set of evaluation criteria that we've developed out of what we know is important to consider when we judge the strategies, not just in the transportation space, but criteria that can be used for judging strategies from the other sectors like buildings and energy. And I think that's all that I really have to share right now. I did want to leave a little bit of space with my time to Aaron or Stan, who also participate in the Equity Working Group activities. And if there are any questions in terms of where we are in our process. Again, I mean, this is a new process and we are all learning together, and it'll take time for things to really, I think, come together, but we are making progress.
Did you want to say something?
I'd prefer to Stan if Stan wanted to add anything.
Anything to what Aaron just reported out on?
Not really, but it's hard, brother. You know, just trying to figure this stuff out. So I'm glad we all working together to make this stuff happen. So thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, and Stan, thank you for referencing the depth. You know, I mean, we're really trying to look at these climate strategies in a pretty new way with this equity lens. And so I really appreciate the time that the Equity Working Group members are putting into thinking through a process, but also, you know, thinking about it in ways that balance structure with also just really good perspective and some of the informal lived experiences of people in our community. So it's a good balance, and I appreciate Aaron, your work and thinking through that.
So the lived experience, that's when the word subjective sort of alludes to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great. Thank you all. Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you. Talk about setting the table for today and also your report out on the transportation working group meeting.
Thanks, Lou. So to give everyone an update of our meeting flow, we're at that report out from the working group stage. You'll start to see a little bit of a pattern where we have feedback from more technical discussions. The transportation working group met on August 11th. They've held the same second Tuesday of the month in the same time block. We had quite a few people from the main climate council attend. So just as a point of clarity, we had some discussions with a few of you. You're welcome to participate in any working group that you choose and multiple working groups. If you show up, we assume that that means that you want to continue getting circulations on that. If you don't show up, we assume that it's not an interest of yours. So we had 22 participants. That's cutting out kind of the coordination staff. And then what we really discussed was how do we want to define these parameters? Like you all are thinking about how these things interact with our community on a very macro scale. And whenever we dug into these strategies, we started trying to get on the same page of how do we define big impact? How do we define small impact? What do we think is expensive? So we spent a great deal of time discussing that and trying to get some perspectives on just how we even define the various things that we're trying to tackle. And we sent a follow-up survey. And so the working group members are filling that out right now. It's a little bit more of a doozy than the original baseline survey, but essentially it asked them to try to come to some consensus by dot voting on high, medium, low sort of impact, and then further detail after we've had some discussion, further detail what sorts of actions that they lumped into these strategies. Let's put a little bit more depth into that. So we should have some more information by the next Climate Council meeting to kind of give a little bit more of a perspective about the types of actions that people are discussing. And then I think that that's something that would be appropriate for you all that you want. Is that what you had in mind? I mean, we've already done this to some degree, but I feel like we need to do this as an iterative, moving back on itself process to make sure that we've given these things ample time to breathe, that we've had time to really consider them, and everyone's opinion changes very slightly every time we discuss it, and whether it's getting a little bit more knowledge and feeling more capable of discussing, or you just, somebody described it, you go, well, I guess I never thought of it like that. I guess we didn't see eye to eye around the table when we were discussing it. So transitioning into today, kicking this discussion off for the building and energy working group, this is just a brief reminder of the baseline surveys. So again, whenever everyone came into the process, we did this entry polling to kind of get an idea for how you prioritize things. That way we could find the appropriate speakers and panelists and working group members to hopefully dive into this. So these are not the final results. We expect this will change, and this one especially more so than others because there's some either or options in there. But those results to kind of pull the curtain back are, these are broken into essentially thirds and grouping by total scoring. And so I don't think it comes as any surprise. Retrofits essentially came in very highly rated. So those are your top four in the green there. That's essentially all retrofits. And then anything that was related to benchmarking came in into the bottom third. So these public benchmarking disclosures.
Can you remind everyone what benchmarking is in layman's terms?
Sure, yeah, so, benchmarking being a public disclosure where you say, here's how much energy you use per square foot. But we've seen other cities like Atlanta, New York, with these public dashboards. And honestly, a lot of the feedback kind of reflected some of the concerns that we've heard from those communities where there's a lot of shame embedded in publicly disclosing that and thinking that that in itself would be a tool to drive down energy use. And that was reflected in your comments that you didn't feel like that would be an effective strategy if we really want to reduce emissions, but it might be a part of a strategy. And then in the middle, those middle thirds, it's a mix of incentives and renewables. And we've got some great presenters lined up today from Amoresco and Tennessee to talk a little bit more about renewables. And then we've got Michael and Josh that are going to be talking about the nuts and bolts of like high performance buildings. How do you reduce the carbon intensity in a building? We're pretty familiar with terms about energy efficiency. You know, you go to Home Depot or Lowe's and you see LED bulbs. You've got, you know, end caps on the aisles that tell you how to save money on your utility bill, but, you know, how do you get lower carbon buildings? And that's really what we're getting at. So some of the insights here, essentially, we had a lot more no votes here. There was a lot more debate compared to the transportation working group polling than others. And really the not important starts reflecting some perspectives that people felt like that there would be an impact on development rates and that there would be an impact that would disincentivize investments in the city of Knoxville in terms of property development. And so those no votes really started, they racked up more the more they felt like that would be a disincentive. An interesting insight is that number 2 item, which is essentially incentives that would meet above code standards. And the technical working group rated that much higher than the Climate Council, and that alone bumped it out like 4 or 5 spots.
Why do you think they did?
Essentially thinking about going beyond the code is a fairly progressive thing. Michael Davis with AIA will talk about that, and Josh will talk about that a little bit more in depth on our panels, which is why I want to make sure I have their perspectives reflected here. But essentially, you're saying that the minimum code, which Knoxville itself is already above the state minimum for building code, so we're already achieving a higher energy savings in new construction than other buildings being built throughout the state. But going even beyond that is a big gray area. You know, how do you define that? What sorts of efficiency measures are you going to require? And you're starting to see the market 5 years ago was very cloudy. There wasn't a lot of certainty about what you the sorts of codes that you would implement, but there's lots of suites of add-on stretch codes, they call them, above code standards that you can kind of pick and choose from. So I don't want to steal AIA's thunder there, but they've got some, and Josh has got some insights as well. So I want to pause here for any questions that we have about the working groups, whether that's equity working group or the transportation working group discussion.
Any questions here in the room before we turn it over to those folks calling in? Okay. No questions. Okay. All right. Well, without further ado, then we will turn it over to the panel presentations for today.
Does anyone on Zoom have questions? Okay.
Yeah. That's why I was looking at Grace.
Okay. Are they supposed to raise their hand?
Or Travis.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Again, if you have questions and you're on Zoom today, just please let Grace know through the chat feature that you'd like to speak, and then we will queue you up. Okay, if no questions, we can dive straight into the panels and presentations today. And we'll be going left to right here. So first we will touch on energy, and we will turn it over to Steve.
Good afternoon, council members. This is Steve Seyfried, as I said, with Amoresco. I have a lot of information to share on these slides, but I think just note that you can review all this information, but I'm going to go ahead and move pretty quickly. So many of you have likely heard the proverb, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, but the next best time is now. Well, that's where we are right now in Knoxville. Change the slide, please. I'm proud to say, as a Knoxville citizen, we've done an amazing job, really since the Haslam administration through Rahero and the recent commitments by Mayor Cannon to have a really planned, concerted effort on sustainable energy. And thankfully, Amoresco's played a part in that successful effort. But honestly, the good news for us is that the soil for this figurative tree is much, much better than it was 12 years ago. We have a lot of opportunity and energy to look forward to. Next slide, please. Right. So although there have been dramatic changes and trends across the energy sector, the bottom line truly is for our commercial and government partners so far has really been the concept of avoided costs. And when you think about that, it's, creating energy and saving energy helps you to avoid not only the immediate cost of electricity if it's lower, but also there's a certainty that is assured in avoiding future growth rates and in knowing what your energy costs are going to be for the long run. Next slide, please. So what I want to do is begin this conversation by talking about avoiding costs in a little bit different way by illustrating the concepts of centralized energy production versus distributed energy resources, or DER. Because really energy comes down to how is it produced and how is it used. So let's go to the next slide, and if you would please focus on the map on the right 2/3. This we're going to talk first about the illustration of a centralized energy grid, and you'll note two lightning bolts near the lake up there, you could so to say. One is a gas/coal-fired plant. The other is a hydro power plant. In this traditional scenario, power generated by these is often generated in a large one location and then distributed to users, residences, businesses, industry. Oftentimes that generation is outside of the grid, but regardless, in a distributed energy resources scenario, power is generated in a more decentralized way. It's generated at various points across the grid. It's not only generated, it's distributed, distributed and shared amongst users, but it offers more reliance on these sources as opposed to being dependent upon the larger sources. Please note as well, you've got at the bottom left of this, you've got wind power, you've got battery storage in those green buildings. Solar PV is spread across the region, as well as electric vehicle or EV stations. All of these are not only sources to tap energy, but also sources to feed energy into the network or into the grid. And that's what these black little leaves separate or indicate. You've got all sorts of technology that needs to happen or needs to be in place for that to happen. So let's go ahead and move to the last slide. So bottom line, what are the costs and what are the value of decentralized energy resources versus centralized? And it really depends. Are you producing power or are you using power? And the value of that, there really is not consensus on some across the industry of what the value or the costs are, but in some ways they are. So again, a lot of information on this slide, but let me just wrap up by saying, what we do know is that there are proven and emerging benefits to the city of Knoxville. So the biggest question that you, our council, and the city needs to answer is, what are the investments that must be made now rather than 10 or 20 years from now? So I'm sure we don't have time for questions, but at this point, I think I'm going to turn it over to Gil at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. If you can hear.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Gil, if you're ready, we're ready for you.
All right, thanks. First slide. Yeah, so I'm Gil Huff, Executive Director of Tennessee. That's the Tennessee Solar Energy Industry Association. Next slide. So solar is in a real boom time right now. Costs have come down dramatically. You can see this with how much TVA has recently added. They're now up to 1,500 megawatts of solar. That's a dramatic increase. The real game changer coming up, though, is storage. Next slide. The same batteries that are used in storage, the same ones used in EV. There's supposed to be a nice little, can you click that slide? There should be a little animation going on there. Oh, well, but we're really complementing the same storage that's going on in the home, and the car uses the same batteries, and that's amount of innovation and R&D right now is just really dramatic. Next slide. So a lot of people think solar, think cost. Well, I would say economic opportunity. In Tennessee, we already have thousands of jobs, Vacher, Shoals Technology, tons of smaller solar companies here in the Valley. And there's a lot of opportunity for Knoxville, but with embracing solar, for also embracing jobs and economic development. Next slide. So when you look at the opportunity here in Knoxville, the partner has to be KUB with energy. KUB is just the critical role. And KUB recently signed a new long-term agreement with TVA so that 5% of the energy has to be generated here locally or can be generated here locally. That equals 80 megawatts of solar. So from the solar industry's point of view, what would we love to see KUB and working with the city and other stakeholders do? And I think you could say that's leadership, drive clean energy, business development across a wide range of opportunities, but with value both for KUB and the distribution system, but also the ratepayers in the city of Knoxville, and leverage existing incentives and business models to drive growth. Next slide. So talking about leadership in KUB, I do want to give hats off. When they signed the long-term agreement, KUB also negotiated the first of its kind with an LPC Green Invest agreement that's adding 212 megawatts of new-to-grid solar power here in Tennessee, or in the Tennessee Valley. That equals KUB having 8% of its annual electricity carbon neutral. And that is absolutely fantastic. It's something that we're hoping other LPCs will duplicate that kind of leadership. Next slide. So when you're looking at other values, value for that I think has to be for KUB and the ratepayers, but value for the city and the residents and businesses. What are some of those other opportunities? Well, I'd actually look at KUB's upcoming pilot for time of use. With a little work, when KUB's actual cost of power is dramatically different depending whether it's on peak or off peak and seasonally. And by TVA or KUB recognizing that value and its cost, solar companies can therefore generate power when KUB most needs it. It's a win-win. And so let's look for those kind of opportunities for win-wins. Next slide. So what is missing? Well, I would say it's ease to feed into the grid at a fair value. Right now, the only existing program is TVA's DPP, which is a very complicated, low-value program. And I think there's an opportunity now for KUB to show leadership in that space that really help the city and its residents have become a leader in climate. So it should leverage things like the investment tax credits, leverage the upcoming TVA Green Connect solar installer quality program, and leverages we're helping projects that come up here within the KUB and Knoxville area to qualify for the state of Tennessee as a certified green energy production facility. Next slide. So that was a lot of stuff real quick. I do want to offer the opportunity. Tennessee does have upcoming solar webinar going on. A lot of leaders from both TVA and the LPCs, including KUB, actually in the afternoon. If you're interested in that, there's a link to that. Feel free to use the partner promo code. That will give you a reduced cost for $40. If that's an issue, please contact me. I'm always happy to answer any questions as far as solar energy and the solar industry here in Tennessee. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gil. We'll move on to buildings now and turn it over to Michael Davis.
Thanks, Brian. Hi, I'm Michael Davis, and I'm here representing AIA East Tennessee. AIA East Tennessee is the local chapter of the American Institute of Architects. We currently have over 300 members, and our domain consists of 25 counties in the East Tennessee area. As architects, we are positioned to be leaders in climate action because more than 40% of US greenhouse gases can be attributed to the building industry. Architects have the ability to lead the change our planet needs. It is our responsibility to help reduce operational and embodied greenhouse gas production in the buildings we design and it is our responsibility to make the business and financial case to clients to help them better understand and support the need to integrate high-performance strategies into all buildings. AIA's goal is net zero emissions in the building sector by 2050. Next slide. Often energy efficiency is labeled as expensive, not because it actually is expensive, but because energy performance wasn't addressed as a design goal from the beginning. The benefits of high quality and high performance design can be achieved by first focusing on passive design. Passive design solutions that are possible early in design, such as optimizing site orientation to minimize solar heat gain, are more expensive or even impossible to make later in the design process. After passive design is optimized, then high performance mechanical systems are designed. And after these efforts have been made, renewable energy technologies can be deployed either on site or through renewable energy purchasing. This process is included in the steps outlined for the 2030 challenge, which states that operations in all new buildings, developments, and major renovations shall be carbon neutral by the year 2030. With more than 90% of 2025's building stock already standing, it is also important to find ways to implement high performance strategies in existing buildings by using guiding principles such as uncover the passive strategies of existing buildings and prioritize the most effective interventions. Architects can bring greater energy efficiency to adaptive reuse projects. And retrofitting buildings strengthens the local economy, as a greater proportion of retrofits budget typically goes to labor, creating more jobs for the dollars spent. Next slide, please. In recognition of these responsibilities and to promote high performance buildings and renovations, AI East Tennessee supports and advocates for the following: developing policy recommendations that promote climate sensitive design and adaptation for all new buildings, new and existing buildings, developing policy and regulations to incentivize significant reductions in operational and embodied carbon, and developing a comprehensive strategy for adopting regulations which promote high performance building, such as the Zero Code or other stretch codes that Brian was mentioning. AI East Tennessee appreciates the opportunity to speak to the Mayor's Climate Council. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. We'll turn it over to Joshua New with ORNL to round us out.
Yep. Thank you, Brian. So I'm Joshua New at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, a PhD in computer science from the University of Tennessee. For the past 11 years, I've worked at Oak Ridge, so pretty local, and I'll be speaking to you today about climate change and building energy impacts via digital twins. Next. So we work a lot with the Department of Energy's Building Technologies Office, and there are 125 million residential and commercial buildings in the entire U.S. If we sum together everybody's energy bills in the past year 2019, it's $412 billion. And we have a pretty good idea of where those electrons and BTUs are flowing in the residential and commercial spaces. Next. That 40% of energy that's consumed by those buildings is 73% of all electricity, 80% of electricity during that peak hour of critical generation. And BTO's goal is to reduce energy consumption per square foot of American buildings 30% by 2030 compared to a 2010 baseline. So how do you reach into every building in America and turn the energy use knob down a third in 20 years? It's pretty aggressive. So we use building energy modeling, where we take building descriptions, weather data, and then we run physics-based calculations to show what technologies are the most cost-effective for a given building. Next. I'm also very involved in ASHRAE, so I'm the vice chair or chair of the technical and standards committees that assign the climate zones for every county in the U.S. and its territories, all 3,242. And we update this every 4 years. And if you look at climate change, we see a northern marching of the climate zones every 4 years. All the counties along the border flip to the next hottest climate regime. And if you go to the next slide, under the IPCC climate change scenarios for A1FI, which is one of the second most intensive by 2100, that red dashed line, the weather you see in Tennessee will be in Michigan in 80 years. You know, our buildings, the electric grid, and some of our critical infrastructure built to withstand that magnitude of climate change is a question that many of us are looking into. Next. So in order to look into that, we use tools. So the Department of Energy has invested over $100 million since 1995 in the development of Energy Plus that does physics simulations, and Open Studio, which allows you to quickly and easily change a building model and do analysis. There's hundreds to thousands of individual technologies that you could put in a building that could save energy demand, emissions, or cost. And so that can be fully automated with current software pipelines. If you go next. These tools are used by several people, including some of the world's biggest HVAC manufacturers. Next. And we've taken this built for desktop software and deployed it on some of the world's fastest supercomputers. So we can run an annual simulation of about 500,000 buildings in 28 minutes. So this stuff can happen very quickly now. We've been doing that. Next, you can zoom through this next slide, Brian. As part of a 5-year vision to create a model of every building in America by the end of this year. So first, you want to benchmark buildings. You want to find out which technologies reduce the energy and emissions from those buildings. And then you have to turn to solar or other renewable sources to offset that remaining energy use. That's what I call the 3-step BRO model to a sustainable built environment. In order to create a model of every building of America, we got 7 steps here. One is every building model has over 3,000 inputs. So which ones matter in terms of the kilowatts and kilowatt hours impact in those buildings? So we've done a full sensitivity analysis, scaled up on supercomputers, looked at different spatial temporal resolution and error rates with different data, established partnerships with key data providers, created algorithms to extract that data from satellite, aerial, street view, and other data sources into building descriptors. And we're not Big Brother, so we don't look inside the buildings. So we have statistical surveys of buildings that we use to guess, how many linear feet of deep freezer that supermarket has. And then we want to make those models free and openly available so that cities like Knoxville can use this to look at what are the most cost-effective ways to save energy and emissions in their area. And we're working with Google's Environmental Insights Explorer, which has been deployed for 100 cities internationally to look at what the buildings-based carbon reduction opportunities are. There was also mention of the AI 2030, so this is the only information I have permission to share, but to answer the question previously, building energy modeling is used in 64% of projects, 75% of the gross square footage designed by architects under the AI 2030 commitment. If they don't use building energy modeling, they're typically 41% more energy efficient than building codes as of 2003. If they use building energy modeling, they're typically 51%. So building energy modeling can help you eke out, depending on how you normalize, about 10% more than what's traditional practice by architects. Next. So we've done this for the University of Tennessee. It took 2 days to create a virtual UT. Next. And we've done this for the Electric Power Board of Chattanooga, Tennessee, involving 178,000 buildings. They've also provided 15-minute electricity use from every single building. And so we've been able to quantify the error rates between our models and the actual measured data of the buildings. We looked at 10 different technologies and color code the buildings, where red is kind of the low-hanging fruit. If you were going to knock on a door to try to market or get energy efficiency into these buildings, these would be the buildings you'd reach out to. And we've been able to quantify energy demand, emissions, and cost reductions to help them, the utility form, program rollout, and other business opportunities. You can go to bit.ly/virtual_EPB and interact with this directly. The idea being, if you can create a digital twin of the area that you're interested in at the cost of electrons, you could do an initial virtual assessment of getting from where we are today to 80% greenhouse reductions by 2050 with an action plan that could involve knowing what technologies to deploy in what buildings and how far that would get you along that plan. So Joshua New at Oak Ridge, thanks for letting me speak. And I think if I understand correctly, we'll open it up to questions from any of the 4 speakers.
Yeah, and again, hit up the chat if you'd like to ask a question. If you're on Zoom, Grace is monitoring that now. I'm scanning the room here and I see Aaron Gill with a question.
I got plenty of questions.
Okay.
Can I start? So just going back to Steve. So you had shown, I think it was maybe your post your last slide, where you showed different brackets where there was consensus or wasn't consensus. And maybe this is something that we want to come back to in discussion. But can you talk more about what is driving the lack of consensus, where it exists? And then I'd love to come back and ask our whole council whether there's consensus, at least among us local stakeholders, on some of those issues.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a great question because it comes back to perspective. And even there's debate amongst the utility providers what those values mean. And, you know, in some ways, TVA is leading the charge because they sell to local power companies. And in other cases, the LPCs, the local power companies, are pushing TVA. So the things that are agreed upon are, at this point, the cost of solar to create. If you look at the capital costs and if you can place these in the right locations, the distribution costs, those are agreed upon. So lower capital, lower distribution expenses. The things that are less, and then also when you get into the evaluation of environmental benefits, that's where it gets more challenging. And you'll notice on the slide that I created, there's a widely recognized and agreed upon value for environmental benefits. And then there's also a non-consensus on targeted environmental benefits. And that's just because the debate is still ongoing. And I think most of us reasonably believe that that climate change is real and that the costs of environmental degradation or issues is extremely high. But, you know, how do you value it? And that's where we can get really good at our assumptions and modeling and the like. But that's where there's less consensus on the value of environmental, the value of job creation, or the value of retaining jobs locally. So that's where there's some debate, and that's where there's general consensus. Does that answer your question, Aaron?
Yeah, thanks. And
sure.
I guess
and I can share some of those resources too in the technical group or wherever. I mean, TVA's generated reports on this and many other sources. Thank you.
I have a question for architect Michael Davis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you think that most architects are fully aware of and on board? I mean, the stages you talked about, like first getting it right in the passive orientation of the design building, and then the materials and energy use, and then the kind of, I mean, is that widespread common knowledge among your profession?
That's a good question. I would say the answer to that is yes. To the degree that we can go through all three of those steps depends on the client and how far they are willing to go through that process. But yes, there is that starting with those passive strategies is definitely something that we are all aware of and try to start with. Something like the building energy modeling is becoming more prevalent in our profession now, which is something that's really helping to create a better workflow for evaluating the energy efficiency that you're able to get.
And so the stages you described are only for new buildings, or it's also for renovations? Because in the city we have a lot.
So for an existing building, you can't necessarily look at new passive strategies unless there's an opportunity to maybe reactivate something that's there. A lot of what happens with existing buildings is trying to understand, how was the building originally designed to operate, and then trying to evaluate what are the kind of best bang for your buck strategies. Is it adding additional insulation to an envelope? Is it using higher efficient mechanical systems? And so those have to be kind of evaluated somewhat on a case-by-case basis, which I think is something that I believe Josh spoke to a certain degree also, which is like, what's the trade-off and what's the benefit versus cost on some of those things. And that right now has to be kind of done on a case-by-case basis. But yes, and it is really then looking at those systems and then designing around kind of that existing condition. So it does take kind of more of an evaluation of the existing building.
We've got a question from chat. Aaron Rose, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Joshua. Nice to see you outside the lab after so many years. And I put the question in the chat. So if you wanted to look at it, but really, can you frame your work in terms of energy savings potential and energy efficiency modeling in terms of the low-income housing stock? And how might you do that for this group, with the equity working group specifically, to help us guide our understanding of that potential for particular neighborhoods or socioeconomically vulnerable communities in Knoxville, to really understand what the energy savings potential is, but also to really address those households that are most energy burdened, that are struggling more than others.
Sure, excellent question, Aaron. There's not too much I can speak of. So at the Department of Energy level, there's been a lot of equity discussion, but not a lot of equity investment or decision. There's been an interaction with large companies that are making multi-billion-dollar investments across the nation in equity issues as it relates to energy use and housing. But that's conversations and statistics that inform the work done by companies, which they typically do not share. That having been said, one thing that we've done with the Electric Power Board of Chattanooga, Tennessee, is we have modeled all the buildings. We can show you the energy and demand reductions of different technologies. And then they have a separate database of about 54 demographic factors. So they can show you who is in equity or is suffering equity issues or large cost burden for energy use. And then they slice and dice that data for their own program formulation on how to target those communities.
Excellent. I believe Maggie had a question.
Yep. So mine is kind of building off of Aaron's. It's more about this EPP study. Who paid for the study, or was that the utility or the city? What's being done with it now? Is EPB now using it to fund their own energy efficiency programs using this tool, or do you know if they have other funding coming from somewhere else to put that into action?
Yeah, that's a lot of questions. Let me make sure I get them all. So the project was funded over the past 3 years. It was a little over $1 million in taxpayer funding, mostly from about 60% from the Building Technologies Office and 40% from the Office of Electricity. EPB provided significant cost share. So I would say it was on the order of $500,000 or more in cost share, which included the sharing of 15-minute whole building electricity use from every single building, as well as the GPS coordinates of their electrical meters and a lot of business sensitive NDA protected information.
$1 million.
Yeah, we made that available online. So bit.ly/virtual_EPB is what we have permission to share right now. You can click on a building, you can change color codes to focus on emissions or energy use intensity or energy savings. There's no demographic information or equity information in that right now, but that's something that's being considered. That project is ending September 30th, so in this month it will be ending, and they are using it for their own program formulation. So they do have separate funding, some from DOE, some from other sources. I can't disclose how much that is, but they're using that for program rollout and implementation based on the knowledge that they've gathered from this project. And
one more on that, on the emissions reductions potential. How did you guys calculate that? What was that using, like hourly data all across TVA and matching with the hourly profile, or is it like some sort of average?
Yeah, so For some reason, the database name is escaping me, but we use the EPA database that tells you what the emissions associated with the energy use for a certain region and time is. Apologies for not remembering that off the top of my head, but I can get you that information if you'd like to know how we converted energy use and simulated energy use to emissions.
Yeah, I just think that gets more important as we have more renewables come onto the grid. The carbon intensity is different at different times, and that disparity is only going to get bigger. So thank you.
Right. Yep. The duck curve is something that many utilities are aware of. And like you said, it's only getting worse. The critical generation hour of each calendar month is the most expensive and dirtiest hour of generation out there. So utilities are very focused on how to dispatch load to match generation rather than vice versa. And that's a very different business model and opportunity space.
Yep.
So the duck curve, or what part of it?
Well, the highest intensity hour.
So, and Rebecca jump in here, but if you think about when a utility, like a day, not like today, because today's so beautiful, but maybe a few weeks ago when it was really hot at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and everybody goes home and turns on their AC, that's usually the time when a TVA, for example, would have to buy power off of the market. Or it's the time when they're ramping up a fossil fuel plant that has historically been curtailed. So, Bull Run Steam Plant, I think one of the ones that's up for retirement, it more or less sits idle until we get that really hot day or that really cold morning, and that's when it has to come online. So when Josh referred to that critical generation hour, that's that peak, and it's what are you using to meet that peak? Because traditionally, it's your dirtier resources.
7 o'clock in the winter, 7 o'clock in the morning in the winter. There's no solar, there's no good storage. So what are you having to run to make sure you don't have rolling blackouts, right? So it's that cost of that generation that we're really focused on trying to figure out how to do different and better.
And I guess there's better insulated buildings and that service.
That's right. But that works on lowering demand every hour. There are certain things you can do, like asking folks through time of use rates, or through your big generator, your big industrial customers to shift to their shift work or whatever.
Do we already do that?
We do some at TVA, and I think KUB is looking into it. Greg may be able to talk a little bit more about it, but right now I don't think we have time of use rates in Knoxville.
They're piloting it. Gabe, can you talk about time of use and where you're at with some of the immediate demand response initiatives?
Yeah, sure can. So we have, our board has passed allowing us to do a pilot time of use rate. You saw the chart that Gil had in his presentation, where we're going to offer that to customers who want to voluntarily participate in that. We want to learn a lot from that, make sure we're doing it right, make sure our customers are truly benefited from it, because it will be a pretty big delta as far as off-peak and on-peak hour rates. So for example, off-peak you'll pay 6.5 cents a kilowatt hour. On-peak you're paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So you've got to make sure you're managing your load very well, or you could pay more than you were before. So we want to make sure we do it right. We want to work with those customers that are wanting to work with us on that. That'll be rolling out this next few months actually, and we'll go through that process ultimately to roll it out to everybody at some point, hopefully, and that will go in line with, it lines us up with TVA's cost of generation, is what it does. For instance, in the wintertime, it's morning peaks. In the summertime, it's evening peaks. And so those windows of time will be critical. What we have also learned, and everybody knows this probably, is that roughly 85% of your time of a week is off peak, but that 15% is critical. Learning that, make sure we educate our folks and we do it right is very critical. We're excited to offer that. Once again, that's something we're going to do it. We're going to do it right, and we need all the folks on this team and this committee and this climate council to help us with that. But that's something we want to, that's a beginning step of many things to come, I think, and as far as rates and as we get more renewables and batteries and solar and other types, that'll be more critical that we have these things to offer our customers. And as everything, as the last thing I'll say is all the technologies that we have in our homes, the Internet of Things, that only makes this world even more critical going forward, that we get good at this type of thing. So as we change out our Nest thermostats or whatever, device you've got nowadays. It's line this up, charging your vehicle to whatever technology you may invest in tomorrow. We got to have this ready. So we're excited about it. Looking forward to working with it more with our customers and getting to know many more on this team as we go forward.
This is Steve Seifried. Something I was unable to get into on my slides in great detail is just what Gabe's talking about, and that is the landscape has really changed, and KUB has made a really big shift in a positive direction from an energy creation and usage standpoint, and I applaud that first. But I'd like to make one other point, and that is there's the financial concerns or focus of avoided costs are so integrated with the financials of a municipality like the city of Knoxville. And there are such great physical needs represented in deferred maintenance at not just the city of Knoxville, but every city. They just haven't been able to reinvest back into their facilities. And the ability to link this huge avoided cost math problem alongside the huge deferred maintenance capital needs assessment type needs that in many cases, well, that was talked about earlier by others. Those being linked together are much more powerful than just dealing with one solely on its own. So I just throw that out as something for the council to consider.
And if I may piggyback on those excellent comments, Gil said it right. I think thermal energy storage and thermal storage, or energy storage in general, is a big player coming up in the future. And there's a big focus on smart, intelligent, connected devices that are in our homes these days. Gabriel mentioned smart thermostats. If you can use smart thermostats with a utility signal to precondition buildings, preheat or pre-cool them to coast through that hour of critical generation, that's serious savings on the utility front that they can use to facilitate deployment or incentivize deployment of those kind of demand management technologies. And so I think that's something that a lot of utilities are looking at, is to better manage the demand on the load side rather than the transmission side.
This has been excellent conversation. I don't want to sidetrack it as much as I want to ground it in the MCC survey results, with specific reference, obviously, to the proposed strategies. And so if it's okay with everyone, we will skip through the break. I don't want to pretend that there wasn't a break slide on there with a nice warm cup of coffee. But I think we've had a natural flow to discussion, and I want to keep facilitating it, so to speak. Just a couple quick ground rules, just to be respectful of everyone. You've already done a tremendous job with this. We're looking to limit discussion to GHG mitigation strategies for energy in buildings. Other topics will be pinned to a parking lot. Again, I think you're already staying on topic today, so kudos there. And through our discussion, we're primarily looking to identify points of leverage for each strategy. Again, that point of leverage theme has come up quite a bit already in our discussion so far, but wanted to repeat those. Again, please use the chat feature if you'd like to chime in with a specific question that we can open up to the group at large here. And I'm also scanning the room here for raised hands directly in front.
And I'm going to jump in here. So this is Brian. So one thing that we're doing differently from the last time, based off the customer satisfaction surveys from everyone, is the meeting follow-up. We're going to take a hard pivot. I want to thank our panelists for participating. Moving forward, we're going to drop them down into attendee mode. So this will be the climate council driving the conversation from this point forward. Just want to be clear that that Q&A portion is done right now.
Thank you, Brian.
Can we bring them back with specific questions that one person can answer?
If they have not dropped off the call.
Okay.
But they're still quote unquote in the room. Okay, so again, as a follow-up to Brian's report out from earlier in the meeting, these are the energy and buildings, high impact practice strategies. They are color coded, so the top 4 are the highest ranked or rated practices by the MCC team members. Then we have the middle, I believe 6, followed by the bottom 5, 4 or 5. Again, largely around benchmarking and disclosure of energy performance. Do you want me to read all of these in order? Everyone can read, right?
Just a question for me in the room. Can someone just email me that slide? Because I cannot read it.
For sure.
Yes.
That'd be great.
So, the question is the first one in the green or the first one in the yellow? What's the difference?
So
Like
really, that's a great observation. So there's some either or options that I kind of alluded to in the setting out the day. So you've got moderate and deep sort of definitions here. So it's like a light touch across more buildings or a deeper touch across less buildings. And so all of those cluster wise in terms of voting, they were all rated very, very highly. And I think that one of the things that folks really need to wrap their hands around is it more important for us to say we want to touch more buildings or less buildings? The savings is roughly about the same using some rough numbers. And as we get further into the process, like for the home, it's the difference between reducing emissions like 4% versus 5% across the entire footprint. So number wise, they kind of work out, and that's very, very broad assumptions. But
so the poll was to go deep on fewer buildings because, well, maybe they're more willing
right.
to engage and do the work and make the investments. And,
right.
and the effects are just as big.
Yeah, so it's about the same. I mean, obviously, this is not supposed to be, 25% over the next, until 2050 sort of thing. So I think all of these should be viewed as kind of an intermediate goal that I think this kind of touches on the idea of when we start off here, is this about setting the tone that we're going to touch as many buildings as possible, or are we going to like try to find ways to really go deep, like technology wise, like how deep are you wanting to go into touch a building? Someone like Josh can model like the full suite of options that can happen. It's financially going to be a bigger pill to swallow for the development community, for the city, for, depending on whether or not you do incentives or financial or some sort of zoning incentive, and whenever we're diving through here on those reactions, that's one of the things in the back of my mind that I want to hear from people. Like, the scores were not that different in the grand scheme of things. So I need, from a staff perspective, I need to hear more clarity and have someone throw out and have a hot take, like, I think we should do less, whatever.
George Wallace, I can't see his face right now, but like as someone in the real estate business, and connected to the development community, what are your thoughts on incentives, getting the development community, residential, commercial, whatever, to think through these costs? Do you have what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a hard time hearing y'all when y'all are live, so I'm catching bits of that. But I think if I heard what your question is, I think the incentives to me, are the most important. I think for a while we're going to be based on COVID and based on the trends that we were already seeing. I think you're going to see a reduction of large buildings being built, and certainly in Knoxville. So I don't know. But I think that market incentives, as far as financial and zoning that achieve, I think those are going to be greater. And then home voluntary, incentives for homes as well. And we saw that. I think we've seen it through the years. And TVA and KUB have offered incentives, and people have used those pretty well. And so I think it's that. I think, like someone said earlier, I think we've already we enacted the International Building Code, adopted the International Building Code several years ago and put those in place. And those incentives, those things are working themselves through, but additional incentives some way, somehow will generate more interest in people doing it. I'm more encouraged to see people incentivized as opposed to being top down, driven by policy. If that answers your.
Yeah, no, thank you. I was curious what you were thinking.
So one of the things that I also thought was interesting on this spread, and I love context from folks in the room and on the call who took the survey. You know, the real emphasis, and Brian, maybe you can say it's not maybe that big of a difference between green and yellow, but when we think about buildings and energy, the buildings and getting changes made to existing structures or new structures versus changing the electricity that we're using in those structures through solar panels. So we're seeing kind of a shift toward let's do efficiency first before we think about renewable energy at the customer scale. That makes sense. I mean, I met you back in 08 and that was your big message, efficiency first, always. So I think that's good, but I'd love some more context from anyone who's thought that through and maybe sees opportunities in terms of, you know, is that really where we need to focus our efforts, or do we need to bundle them in some way that's not reflected in this ranking?
You have to call on someone.
Any thoughts in the room?
It looks like somebody's on.
Nancy, Rebecca, Amy? I see we have Maggie. Maggie, you're up.
All right, thanks. I was gonna say something similar to what Aaron said there on, you know, the focus seems to be on energy efficiency but I mean, I think we need to do, maybe if we can't do all of these, I think we need to do most of these. It's a matter of prioritization. I also think that, you know, similar to what's been said on this whole new buildings versus existing buildings, I mean, you know, how many new buildings are going to be met, and we need to focus on decarbonizing quickly, and we're not going to get there if we're just, you know, only looking at new buildings. And then I think that my last point is the second one on the yellow, talking about electrification as decarbonization. I think that's key. And I think that one of the first ways we can do is to not incentivize new gas. You know, KUB currently has an incentive if you switch from electric to gas on your water heater or your, you know, your heating or something like that. And so, you know, obviously if we're trying to incentivize people to go the other direction, you know, we're not all paddling the same direction there. So I think that those things are key to keep in mind as well.
I'm curious, getting to some of the questions around any of these strategies for which the city currently is well positioned, and if there is a lead by example component to this. And the second question on here is what are the strategies where the private sector resources and leadership are best suited, and if there's not a dichotomy, but if there's a plan that needs to be put into practice so that, to Maggie's point about everyone paddling in the same direction, you're working toward that 80% goal by 2050 in the most efficient and effective way. Are there any thoughts around?
Well, I was just wondering if there are some private sector entities that, you know, have the financial wherewithal to capture the cost over decades and do that investment and be that moment, like, you know, be that leader, and say, you know, the city can do that, but it's even more helpful if a private entity is like, you know, look, we know that this is going to cost more upfront and that the savings won't happen, but not only will the savings happen over time and maybe at an accelerated rate, but also it's good for the environment. Like they get the financial benefit, but I don't know if we have those leading voices out there in the private sector in Knoxville yet. Maybe we do, and I don't know about it, but if I don't know about it, that's probably not very common. But if we could find more who want to do that and be champions in that way and highlight them. And then, but then, so I feel like the financial, money is a very powerful incentive. If you can just get people to have that instead of what's going to be, instead of passing on, like someone who builds the building is not someone who operates it over the course of the building's lifetime. So how do you get the developer who builds it to, or renovates it? I think Maggie's right now, we're mostly going to be dealing with renovations of existing buildings or upgrades. So how do we get the people who are going to be passing on ownership to take that into account more? Well, one of the slides that talked about, it was the solar guy, how we can get the financial, like federal government incentives, like, can we do a better job connecting, some outside monies to this? Like Chattanooga seems to have gotten some good connections for that building survey thing. I don't know the details of that, but getting that kind of survey sounds pretty amazing.
So one of the things, I don't know if Josh is stuck around, but I wanted to ask him, he mentioned he was trying to take that digital twin nationwide, I think, right?
Digital twin?
So like the model, I think that was something that they're working on, maybe expanding across the country, and I don't, if I heard that right. My question is, how do we take those types of tools that are available and use them to really hone in, whether it's on particular strategies like a heat pump program. I know TVA, you've done a lot of assessment on this data too, or if it's on buildings, to where are the buildings that we might need to target? Maybe it's a district, maybe it's a neighborhood, maybe it's a particular type of large hospitals and working with the
we talked about green overlay
Rescos.
district.
Yeah, right.
Josh is back on.
So Josh,
we brought Josh up for clarity, and
Yeah.
then we've also got a hand raised from Stan as well.
Okay, great. So Josh, are you taking that model nationwide eventually? Is that something that Knoxville would have future access to or not?
Yeah, so we're on track to have that completed by the end of this year, with plans to make it publicly available, both the energy use, simulated energy use, and the models available in the first quarter of 2021 through a data partner. But we'll also be making that as an open public data set. So if there are people that are interested in grabbing those building models for a certain area like Knoxville and simulating with different technologies, that will be free and openly available to do.
So to a follow-up to that, I think to the point about going deep versus less deep and wider, would the modeling be able to show different GHG mitigation simulations, reducing energy consumption?
Yes, as long as you're very specific about the technology. Like I said, there's hundreds to thousands, some of which may or may not be applicable to different building types. Changing the refrigeration system of a supermarket is very different from a refrigeration system in your home. But yeah, what we typically do is we assess what's called the technical adoption potential. So if you waved a magic wand and put this technology in every building, what's the energy demand emissions cost that you could save? And we can do that for individual technologies or retrofit packages of technologies. But I will point out this is focused on existing buildings, things that we can see with existing LiDAR satellite imagery. It would not capture the more AIA-focused new building construction.
And I'll say, we were working with Knox Planning to try to get some data on development patterns. So we're running the CAMA model, which is basically computer-assisted property. So we're getting total square footage, and then we're correlating some permit data to kind of figure out about how much square footage could we estimate would be turned over based off the past 10 years. So we're building some of that out so that we can do our modeling for this as well.
Excellent. Okay, Stan, you had a question.
Yeah, I got a question and a statement. I'm trying to figure out which one is which. So I'm hearing a lot of things about incentives, right? And how to incentivize stuff. But one of the problems that we've been running into when we're dealing with like weatherizing buildings or solar paneling buildings, that doesn't carry over to the next owner, right? Let's say a granite countertop would, like in the aspect of how you do your appraisals. So I don't know if this is a question for George or if this is a question for the mayor, but if you incentivized the builders to say, if you put this stuff in there, your appraisal is going to be higher, right? So how do you get the energy efficiency upgrades in these new buildings or even in existing buildings to say this is appraised value based on that this building has less energy consumption? How do we actually go about even selling that? Because if you tell me I put a granite countertop in my kitchen, I'm going to get $5,000 more value in my house. That would make more sense to me. But if I put $5,000 worth of value of weatherization in my house and it doesn't give me anything, I mean, what incentive am I doing that for? Is there a way to get the Builders Association? Is there a way to make this into policy? I don't want to get into that. It's politics, but at some point, I want to make sure that I put value into my building, into my house, into something that's going to enter me into something different. And if I'm looking at it as if you guys big brother me into doing this, I'm gonna have a problem. Or do I incentivize you into doing this? How does that work?
So George, I don't know if you could hear, I hope you can hear Stan better. Do you have any real estate perspective on like how that value of efficiency transfers between owners at point of sale?
Yeah, if you lower the building's expenses, then that would raise your profit essentially, and that would raise the value of your building. So I mean, it's not if it actually works and that actually benefits. So that if you put in $100,000 worth of environmental issues, it lowered your costs and that lowered your overall net operating, then you'd be a lot better off and your building would be worth more. So it'd be as simple as that. If you put it in and it doesn't work or it doesn't reduce it as much as you say, then it's not. So it's not, it may be harder to see than a granite countertop that you can see and you can visually see that. But this is something that's has a long-term payout. It's not a short-term payout. You have to lead, government's got to lead. I mean, we just converted a TVA building to Knox County Schools into UT, and what retrofits was put in there and why? And why weren't more done? Well, it's expensive, and I guess they didn't see the return on investment. And so, I mean, I think that you can look for opportunities like that, but it's going to come down to what's it cost me, and is it really going to lower my cost over a period of time that I can actually see a return on investment? And 10 years would be a return on investment, 20 years, but you get out much past that and people can't see it. And so it's got to be, and that's why, they're not builders, developers, in my opinion, or I'm not going to do it on a voluntary basis just because I think it ought to be done. It's got to be based on incentives, and it's got to be based on return on investment. Can I get more for it? So far, I don't think we've proven in the market that single family houses, if you really put in a lot of cost saving measures and a lot of that technology, that you're going to see the return on investment. The investment's higher, but we're not seeing the ones that I've seen done so far. We're not seeing those sell faster and for better price, or even getting the price back. So the market's not quite there yet. It may get there. And I don't think it will get there, but it's not there today. If you build them side by side and you put in $20,000, let's just say 10% of the value of a house, and you put it in on the cost saving measures, I don't think you're going to get 20%. You're not going to get 10% more. And so far, and the market's we're not there, not here. I mean, maybe in other places, but not here.
If I can chime on this too, I think that it's important to think about how you incentivize things as well, because there are sort of traditional incentives, rebates, or whatnot on a new HVAC system, a new heat pump. But there are also, more innovative ways, what's called, on-bill financing, where the cost of, putting in that new HVAC, super efficient HVAC system goes with the KUB bill, or it goes with the, the house address, or, whatever. There are ways to look at it, besides just a traditional incentive. And those, Stan can kind of get to, I think, some of what you're talking about. And I think that's something for the, equity working group to look at, because, you would have different kinds of incentives, I think, depending on if you're looking for, a single family owner occupied house versus, a, multifamily, rental building. Or, single family rental is, a huge market in Knoxville. And so there are ways that you can incentivize and do these kinds of, real low hanging fruit that have 2-year paybacks, put in a heat pump in an existing home, and you're helping with energy burdens, you're helping with indoor air quality, and you're doing the greenhouse gas emission reductions all at the same time.
Mayor, did you want to say something?
She said it better than I was going to.
If I can jump in real quick, I'll say I agree with Maggie. One thing we've struggled with is incentives and what happens with those in an equity standpoint, right? So we've incentivized individual solar panels, we've incentivized efficiency, and it seems like the higher income folks in the valley are able to take advantage of that. So it's just something you have to put in the calculus with how you do the incentives, but it's very important. The second point, and this is somewhat silly, but I'll just ask because I'm not as familiar with buildings in Knoxville, but do you get, does the mayor come visit you and there's a little flag you get to fly if you've made your building green? Is there something to help people want to be a leader in the city as far as that kind of communication standpoint?
So here's the conversation I've had a couple times. People, this is past administration, where they'd say, oh, we want the mayor out because we were quote efficient, but they didn't get LEED certified. They didn't go through the IGCC. So we've struggled a little bit because, anyway, we should talk about this because I think that this is one of the opportunities, but it's like, how do you set the bar to where there's a little bit of a measurable
But LEED is a little bit bureaucratic, so and cost, and so I can understand, but
but it's like, but maybe going back to, if we can define the suite of retrofits that are really applicable to a wide variety of places, maybe you do, if you stay kind of similar to the East Score program.
Well, we also I'm more familiar with Clean Marina. If you meet these standards, you get to fly that Clean Marina flag. People really love flying that flag.
Yeah.
Right? So maybe there's something.
We could I know, is it Keep Knoxville Beautiful? Knoxville has the orchid or onion award.
Yeah, the orchid and onions.
Keep Knoxville Beautiful, we could maybe skip the onion part, but we could have rewards for entities that did a green renovation and how we define that.
I know it's small, but I do think it would change a little bit of the conversation.
A little bit of that, get a label. And I think similarly, I don't know, there could be an element where residential folks kind of get into that too.
Neighborhoods competing a little bit or something? I don't know.
I think there is a sense of, the LEED, the IGCC, those are big hurdles to overcome. And there's a lot of people who really want to take a pretty solid first step. But you're right, there's not a program right now that acknowledges that.
But without that program, it would be hard for the city to officially, So
well, you just did a burn all over town saying, rah, rah.
Yeah. Everything green.
Yeah, greenwashing. But it is an interesting idea of how do you create something that allows that to stand in a more structured way without creating this huge burden.
To kind of branch off of that, one of the things our neighborhood has done is our national wildlife certification. And I wonder, and that it gives you several easy examples of things you can do at your home. And I'm just thinking what if we branched off and had, and with that one you can get a little sign to show off I'm certified at my house. And just thinking could we do something like that for energy efficiency and just come up with a list of and advantages things you can do to become whatever
And
energy
it's a
certified.
little award, and then it gets bigger as you do more stuff.
Yeah, just something to
People
promote.
love signs and flags. I mean,
Just something. We remind people to speak up, people on the chat are having a hard time. That's it. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, Aaron Rose, I think you had a question or comment.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I appreciate Rebecca's comment about trying to make sure TVA programs are accessible and that they're are equitable. One thing that I find that's one of the most impressive things about TVA's Home Uplift Weatherization Program, which does operate in Knoxville, is that it doesn't operate by a savings to investment ratio, which is pretty much unheard of with a lot of low-income weatherization programs. Even the Department of Energy's WAP program is driven by savings to investment ratio. And the reason that I've heard from TVA why they do this or why they don't use that approach is because it falls within their mission to make sure that housing quality, that energy is affordable for people in its service territory. And that's a really important thing to remember as we move through some of the strategies that are being proposed, that it doesn't always have to be cost effective. If we were to take a human rights-based approach to this work, which means that it would be centered in equity, it would just be, we do this program, we run this program because it is the right thing to do, because it actually does make housing more affordable. If you think about the Southeast and the energy burden, you know, in this geographic region for people at 200% or and below poverty at the federal threshold, you have a 16.9% energy burden. For 100% poverty, you have upwards of 30% energy burden. And that, and housing burden in total is supposed to be, you know, at 30% burden, or you're considered highly housing burden. But if that 30% of your income is already going to energy, imagine what that housing burden is like. And honestly, it's really, I'm tired of seeing these survey, you know, our survey research come back with these statistics that tell us that a third of the people going into this program find it extremely difficult to pay their bills, their energy bills, that they are having to choose between heating and eating, that they're not paying for their prescription medications because of these energy bills, that their heating and cooling equipment is months that they need to use it. So I think that if this housing, if this, you know, buildings and energy, if these strategies don't address some of these needs for people suffering in Knoxville through energy, because of this energy burden, or because of they don't have access to a weatherization program, because the waiting list in Knoxville is 2,000 to 3,000 households long, then I think that we're going to continue to have a big problem, especially as our temperatures, you know, drop in the winter and increase in the summer seasons. So I'm just looking across these strategies right now, and I'm just wondering, you know, which ones could benefit this population in Knoxville the most. And I'm not inspired. So if somebody could help me point to, you know, where we can alleviate this human suffering because it's the right thing to do, and how to go about that, then, you know, please, if I'm missing something, then please let me know.
So I think, Aaron, I'll jump in a little bit, because I think where I look across these strategies, any of them that involve residential efficiency, to me, weatherization is 100% part of that. So just, if anyone else was wondering where that weatherization low-income piece falls, I think it falls very firmly underneath any of those strategies that address residential efficiency. So then to also make another point, because I think this is a really important one, Aaron, when we think about leverage and we think about the ability to address what I call win-win-wins, you know, how do you advance multiple priorities that we have in our city, so that it's not just about climate, but it's climate and. To me, the affordability and the affordable housing considerations that we all have, and has been a priority for the city for, you know, years now, multiple administrations, you know, you see that reflected in our community development 5-year plan, you see it reflected in a lot of the program requirements that our community development office offers. So we already have a very firm foundation to think about linking energy efficiency with affordable housing. And I think as we move forward into both of these conversations, that this is one of those areas where the Venn diagram really overlaps nicely. Because when you think about energy and the affordability, those, I mean, they're just inextricably linked, as you said, Aaron. If one's not affordable, then the other's not affordable. And so I think this is a huge point of leverage and opportunity to just continue to lean in on at all stages, whether that's TDA, KUB, obviously the city as well, because it is something that really hits home to a lot of people.
And just as a point of clarity, these are not necessarily actions. These are strategies. These are very high level talking points. We're setting a vision here. The Climate Council and the working groups are defining what they think of would be actions under this. So I would fully anticipate weatherization being a part of that, just like Aaron said.
And this discussion serving as a primer for those more technical discussions.
Correct.
Down the line.
Aaron Rose, this is Stan Johnson. I just wanted to jump in for just a second. I agree with you 100% because what we're talking about, guys, is if we have 2,000 people on a waiting list, these strategies don't really address that large of a problem. And that's what I'm worried about. Are we really thinking about this in a large enough concept to grasp what Aaron is saying? If there are 2,000 people that's on a waiting list and we only can do 100 people a year based on the dollars we have now, that person that's the last person, we're talking 20 years from now. If we're back to talking about 20 years from now and carbon reduction and heat going up, that person is in way worse shape, again, when you plant a tree, right? 20 years ago. And if we're talking about this in these kind of terms, we need to be thinking about 20 years in the future. And I love what Gabe is doing over at KUB. I love what TVA and stuff is doing. But when I start thinking about those kind of things, are we really talking about the same stuff? Because we're talking, if you're talking 2,000 people on a waiting list, that means the problem is really like 10,000 people. And if the problem is really like 10,000 people and we're talking like $10,000 a home to do weatherization, we're really talking about $100 million, people. You know, so I just want to make sure that we're grasping the top end of this thing and not minimizing, oh, if we do a good job here, it'll work out. Because, I mean, we did a great job, I think, with Keene, and that was just 1,300 people. And we're still 2,000 people on the waiting list. So are we really thinking big enough is my question.
Well, and I think these are great points of feedback, and I definitely expect, Stan, you to be saying this at the equity working group, but I hope you'll join us in October as we dive further into these and start defining actions. But I also want to say that whenever we're discussing this, we definitely need to apply this equity lens. What I want to make sure that we're not doing, though, is losing scope of the total savings that we need to discuss as well. Because there's a big portion here. We're talking about actions, individual actions under one single strategy here. But what I'm not hearing necessarily, I'm hearing we need to touch more homes for residential, but we're not talking industrial, we're not talking commercial. What I've heard today, and I just want to spit it back at you as like a reaction, just to make sure that everyone's hearing the same thing as I've heard it, is that there seems to be a little bit of discomfort and unease with the commercial and industrial aspects because there may be an unfavorable ROI. And I'm not hearing a tremendous amount of solutions there, but I'm hearing a very specific weatherization, low income, residential focus. You're gonna have to expand that scope. You're not even, whenever we're talking reducing and hitting the emissions targets for residential, you're gonna have to take your scope outside of just weatherization. You know, I don't wanna misuse a quote from Gabe from years ago, so chime in and correct me if I'm wrong, but like 2% of KUB's customers miss a bill payment. That's not enough to get us to our residential emission reduction target. It doesn't matter if it's 10,000 homes. We got to touch more homes as a part of this process, and you can't just apply a low to moderate income, you know, and say that's who we need to touch. Like, yeah, we touch them first for sure. How do we get the next step? How do we get the people that have And how do we prioritize what we think people should be doing financially with their home that have the means to make an investment in their home, whether that's a rental, whether they live in it. We need to get to that
So
at some
maybe,
point as well.
think of different strategies for people who are making those inhumane decisions about heating versus eating. But then for the other, big percentage of people who are paying their utility bills on time and aren't as energy burdens, have financial incentives where that, there is a, they are making those tough, they're not super poor, so they need an incentive to do it. Because otherwise they're like, well, I'll just pay more on my utility bill. How do we get them to change their, to renovate their homes, to weatherize their homes, to change, to do the smart thermostats and all those things. So multiple strategies.
Yeah, correct. I just want to make sure that we're discussing all that. I know that Maggie brought up some great points about on-hold financing, case type formats, things like that, that we need to be thinking about. And I just want to make sure that we're taking a step, we're pausing, and understanding that we're going to have to go beyond just weatherization if we want to hit these targets. I mean, we're talking about hitting a pretty substantial emission reduction target that won't be solely addressed as we define weatherization, which is dealing with low to moderate income people that struggle to pay their utility bill. We got to go deeper than that.
So it becomes part of a broader GHG mitigation strategy, right? A very important one, but we also have to factor in account solutions for commercial and industrial facilities as well.
And residential customers that maybe can afford to make those investments. How do we get them to make those investments to reduce their individual load when they have the financial means to do so? But
yeah. And I would ask, like, what are some of those solutions to be thinking about those? What are the partnerships? If you look at, Aaron mentioned Home Uplift with TVA, very successful for addressing, LMI customers. It's only going to grow once it can come out of the COVID storm. So yes, that's a very good point. I think Maggie had a question or a point.
Yeah, I just on that part, I think home energy uplift is a very good start, but it's pennies on the dollar, and it's only for single family owner occupied homes, and it already has this huge waiting list. So like Stan says, the need is huge. I don't think I also agree, I don't think we can only focus on residential. I think that there are particularly places like small businesses that also struggle with energy burdens. There's, I don't know if this is the case in Knoxville specifically, but there's a tendency, more broadly for larger users or, industry. They're very already heavily incentivized just based on their electricity usage and the way that their rate structures tend to be set up to reduce their, energy and to have the, means and know-how in order to do so, compared to, small businesses and residents that don't always have either the, know-how. They don't know that there's this, HVAC that's available to them that could pay back in 2 years or less. And they don't have the means to put up that capital to do that, even in a situation where there's a 2-year payback. So I think that, it's important again for us to focus on all of these things, but we need to prioritize where there's this need. I think also, particularly with small businesses, when you look at energy burden, if we help small businesses, they'll be able to, hire more, pay their workers more, that sort of thing. And so that helps with the other side of the energy burden as well.
To the comment you made, I forgot, where do the numbers lead you? So if I was just like buildings, where can you get the most bang for the easiest amount of leverage to pull? Is that commercial building?
If you're talking leverage, that's probably more of a Josh knew, like what the landscape looks like, sort of modeling exercise. Total kilowatt hours, total therms, I happily share that. We published that on our knoxvilletn.gov/emissions.
But it's
just did a good job bringing back from, you can get Boston residential, because there's so much we want to do there. But if we're just trying to get you to your goal in buildings, What's, yeah, what is the?
Well, I was going back to
Commercial is the big sector.
God, yeah, no, you're totally doing your part. That was pretty good.
But what building, I put in the building category, I just was wondering.
I think so. Industrial is lowest, right? Like if we
Industrial is
use
one of
three
the lowest in the
sectors.
city.
Yeah.
I mean, once you get outside of the city, that spikes because you have more industrial parks in the county. Commercial is our biggest,
Okay.
you know,
Okay. That's helpful.
large buildings, large load.
But we don't have it broken down further than that. I don't know if that's data KUB even.
Yeah. We break everything into those three primary sectors: residential, commercial, and industrial.
Yeah, but I don't know if there's additional breakdowns. There might maybe.
That is a good follow-up, though, just to think about that this is the overarching goal. There are certainly other objectives to meet that goal, such as what we've discussed, but taking a step back and really thinking about those points of leverage are important.
Do we have time for you to kind of ask the group? I mean, I don't want to open our can of worms, but I'm really interested because I feel like where I see so much interest, again, like it's efficiency. For the folks on the call, for the folks at this table, like there's so much interest in the efficiency side that to me, if I had to say, again, like where does the city invest? If we had to invest dollars, I mean, at the community scale, invest in efficiency is where, what I'm feeling, what I'm hearing is that reflected. Anyone want to chime in for another point of perspective here?
As opposed
to renewables, as opposed to the, I mean,
Storage.
there's some storage stuff on there, kind of the electrification, you know, there were some other elements, but efficiency really seems to be where our hearts and heads are at.
Can I ask the mayor a question? Do we have wiggle room in our tax budget for incentives? Because usually that's in terms of property tax. You know, if someone says.
No.
So where would these?
That's why we want to tap into.
Who would pay for these
TDA or federal
incentives?
subsidies. We don't have local, I mean, that's.
So
Not
really,
a
the incentives
state.
would come from our energy partners, from,
But that all comes from your rates you pay.
yes.
So there's no bucket of money at TDA except for the rates you all pay, right? And so this is, Aaron made this point, and it's the one we struggle with a lot, which is the part of our mission, which is serving those low-income people, but recognizing that that increases their rate, those investments, and it increases everybody's rates, which is what brings in jobs. You know, one of the reasons we're very competitive and have been able to bring in Google and Facebook and other big people are our rates. Right, so it's all trying to figure out the dollars around all this with really, really tight margins. And that's the ultimate struggle. I think we would all really like to do some investing, more investing in some of these things, but how do you do that and people be able to continue to afford their power bills?
But commercial property owners, because of COVID, are now faced with a big problem with people working from home. Now, people are going to downsize, they're going to try to renegotiate their lease. How are they going to have money to invest on energy saving programs?
That's right. Yeah, well, those are good questions. I don't know.
It's very important. I don't know if we can answer that in the next 3 minutes,
It
but
doesn't keep us from trying to move forward, because we have to keep moving forward, but we're going to have to
The
come
flip
up with
side is
some
all the
creative
transportation that's been
solutions.
cut
I
out.
know, kind of like, well, maybe that's what everyone's telling me, we might net break
We
even.
might. I do though want to get back to Aaron's question and allow folks to respond, whether our hearts and minds right now are in efficiency more than other energy strategies, renewable energy, storage,
I mean,
electrification.
knowing that it's, I mean, I think we've said this, like, it's always, it's like, both and, but again, I mean, as a city, we gotta figure out how to prioritize our time and effort in the short term.
Well, Aaron, I'm looking at, you know, KUB and pretty much did the Rounded Up program. So as far as that goes, that's where, I mean, the city's not putting, I can't say not putting any money, but that is pretty much the biggest amount of money that's going into weatherization right now, right? So when you start thinking about other ideas, Some of the stuff you guys did, like buying the poles and putting all the lights, LED lights in, how did that work out? You know, how much money did that save? How much carbon emissions did that save? Are we still talking about electric vehicles, not just for the city, but for UT and the county and all that kind of stuff? How do we get more partners involved in just this project? Because I don't think the city by itself, of course, and KUB by itself can reduce all this carbon emission. So how do we develop those partnerships? You know, if we're still talking about a baseball stadium down here in the next 5 or 6 years, how much energy is that going to pull out off the grid? You know, so those are the things I'm looking at as well, not just the aspect of low income weatherization. That's my biggest priority, because I know the people are energy burdened. You know, Aaron Rose said it best. You're talking about 14, 15% of people's income. Now you're talking about 30% of people's income going to just their housing, but it's not just their housing. That's going just their utility bill. So if we go up to their housing and all that stuff, now we're talking about 80% of these people's income. You know, so that would be me. But the other stuff to me is, how do we create partnerships? Like we're talking to what is that, Josh over there in Oak Ridge. That I never heard of nothing like that. You can actually plug in a system and tell me how much stuff is happening across my whole city or my whole area code or zip code, should say. That's amazing kind of stuff. So to me, it's the partnerships and how do we pull this stuff off? Because we're going to need a lot more money than we're thinking that we need to do all this. And I don't want to sit here and say, well, the city has money, KUB has money, you got, or George, hell, George is rich. Give us some money, George, you know, to make this stuff happen. I want to make sure that we create enough partnerships to actually get this information and just really the idea out to people, and it doesn't become politicized.
And cost avoidance, how can you use that to finance the investments? That's, that's pretty abstract for people on the detail side of things.
Yeah. Okay, any final thoughts from anyone on our Zoom call? On our Zoom, sorry, on the Zoom. Any final thoughts here in the room before we switch over? Before we wrap up the next steps, the bridge to October.
We're in the
summer pod, we're going to the blue.
Have a difficult journey with the blue sky.
So our next meeting is the Energy and Buildings Technical Working Group. It's scheduled for October 13th from 1 to 3 Eastern. As Brian pointed out earlier, MCC members are encouraged to attend. Their participation is not required. And we'll also be sending out a customer satisfaction survey, just checking your temperature about how today went, how we might be able to improve on this new dual track / hybrid model. Brian, did you have any other thoughts that you wanted to share?
No, that's the big one. I appreciate everyone's time and everyone's patience today while we're testing this hybrid meeting. Your feedback is extremely helpful. We try to incorporate as much as we can in between meetings. So let us know how you feel, if you feel like there's any improvements that we could get done. Other than, you know, we've already gotten some great private messages from you all as we've tweaked along the way. Just want to thank everyone for their time. The working group meeting in October, be prepared to come with your sleeves rolled up. I mean, I feel like we unearthed a lot of anxiety about strategies and what actions might look like. And I feel like most people, when it came to transportation, they feel very strongly, you know, EVs are the future. It's pretty easy to rally around that. Yeah, we should have more walkable, bikeable communities. Yeah, you love that. Everybody wants sidewalks in their neighborhood. Those are really easy things to rally around. We're getting into difficult things to discuss right now. We're talking about affordability of your utility bill. How livable is your house? These are going to be meaty things that the reason I think we saw a lot of no votes in those baseline surveys when pretty much every other group, your voting was like 4 and 5. You felt very positively about everything. When you saw these laid out, you suddenly felt like, oh, I'm having to pick and choose between these things. Let's unpack it all. we're gonna have a full arsenal of things that we need to have, stand at a really good reference. There's a lot more that has to be done than just what the city and KUB can do from their ends. Like, that's why you're all here. That's why you're a part of this. And I look forward to continue our conversations with you all. Thank you. We're going to close the meeting. If you need anything, reach out to our team.
Thank you.
And if we have another in-person meeting, Brian promises he's going to bust out the jacket. I know this is the recurring joke of the end of every meeting, but I really want to see it in CG. I was very disappointed to see it.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you
everyone
all.
on the call.
Very nice.
Great day.